In 1179 AD, the Church called a third Lateran Council. The boundaries hoped for from the affirmation of canons from the first two councils of the Lateran went largely unheeded. The system agreed upon by the Church, the Holy Roman Emperor, and various monarchies for electing the Pope remained ineffective to rise above the political standoffs between various factions in the Church, temporal leaders, and monarchies. In Venice in 1177, an agreement between the Holy Roman Empire and the Church ended one such disagreement. Back in 1159, Pope Hadrian IV had died. The cardinals at that time elected two popes together, namely Roland of Siena, who took the name Alexander III, and Octavian of Rome, who, though he was nominated by fewer, nevertheless, with the support of the Emperor Frederick, usurped the name of Pope Victor IV. Church historians describe what happened next. The emperor, wishing to remove everything which stood in the way of his authority in Italy, declared war upon the Italian states, and especially the Roman Church, which after its struggle for ecclesiastical liberty for so many years was enjoying great authority. The emperor carried on the war for a long time. A serious schism had arisen out of this conflict, and after Victor IV, two anti-popes were nominated in opposition to Alexander III, namely Pascal III and Callistus III. At last, when Alexander had gained the victory, he promised the emperor at Venice that he would summon a general council. The particular object of this council was to put an end to the schism within the Church and the quarrel between the emperor and the papacy. The Church continued to act separately and elect its own pope only to have certain monarchs, this time Frederick I, who had fought during the Second Crusade, interfere. When the council finally did convene, condemnations of heresies by a group called the Cathars, or as they became more widely known, the Albigenses, laid the groundwork for what would later become one of the darkest actions the Church would ever take. During the council, the Church also began for the first time to create distinctions between Church and state. Issues east in Constantinople were also getting more complicated. The death of the Eastern Emperor Manuel I left his wife, a Latin princess, Maria of Antioch, acting as regent for the rightful heir, Alexios II Comnenus. As a Latin herself, she showed favoritism to the Latin contractors and vendors in governmental affairs, and the Latin people in general held great sway in Constantinople. The everyday Byzantine, as well as the upper classes in the city, grew increasingly resentful. Anger spilled over, and in 1182 AD, as if a repeat of the murderous act toward the Latins in the 1170s, Andronicus I Angelos overthrew the boy Alexios and his mother, and took the throne of Constantinople for himself. He entered the city as emperor to popular support, encouraging the rise in Byzantine patriotism that had been responsible for his rise to power. The celebration became violent, however, and eventually led to the expulsion of the Latin population from the city of Constantinople. Many anticipated a violent uprising against the Latin population again and left by sea. In the fervor to clear the city of the Latins, tens of thousands were indiscriminately killed. Latin people in Thessalonica were particularly hard hit. The fervor to expel their Western counterparts knew no limits, and even people in hospital beds, women and children, were not spared. It was a particularly sad and ironic chapter in East-West relations that the level of violence the Christians perpetrated against other Christians rivaled the violence of the heaviest crusades against Islam thus far. Andronicus did nothing to quell the violence, an act for which he would pay dearly. Within just a few years, he was dished a sweet revenge when he was deposed and handed over to Latin guards at the Hippodrome to be tortured. East-West Christian relations then reached an all-time low. In 1185 AD, circumstances compelled Christians in the West to once again raise their eyes to the potential danger amassing toward them and Jerusalem. Usually, political intrigues between regional Muslim leaders prevented them from organizing into a large unified body. That was now changing. A force had grown around Egypt that left all the gains of the First Crusade in shambles. King Baldwin IV of Jerusalem, the only crusader whose force could hold off this new Muslim army, had died, finally succumbing to his advanced stage of leprosy. The Muslim leader, Saladin, had grown in strength, and after the death in rapid succession of Baldwin IV, then his child nephew Baldwin V, the line of succession left Queen Sibylla ruling in Jerusalem. This was a critical situation. Baldwin IV had been uniquely able to check Saladin's advances and keep the balance of power in the Levant stable, albeit a tense stability. Both Adin and Baldwin had proven great warriors, and the carnage of their engagements had compelled both to simply keep the other in check, lest they kill each other off completely. Nur ad-Din, who had been a key figure in the Second Crusade, was the Zengid lord of Saladin. After watching his predecessors struggle to unify the Muslim world, and facing a new challenge himself from a growing Turkish and Asiatic presence, Saladin cut his teeth taking Aleppo and Mosul, which previously had belonged to Saif ad-Din. Salah ended up controlling and unifying much of Islam in the Levant when he rose to leadership in Egypt. He handled the region as one with velvet gloves covering iron fists. Not generally merciful, but could be if it benefited him. In his command of violence, he was just as other Muslim leaders had been, just much better at it. In other ways, Saladin was not like the previous Islamic rulers. In an interesting anecdote, the great Jewish thinker Moses Maimonides was so impressed with him that he became part of his retinue of companions. Later, when the same offer came from the hero of the Third Crusade, Richard of England, to join his court, Maimonides turned him down. Saladin had the capacity of being more diplomatic when it came to the way he governed if it suited his purpose. He seems to have learned a great deal from the division of his forebears. He proved much more of an opportunist than they had been, and this allowed him to gain more than previous Islamic rulers had. This is not to suggest that he could not be barbaric. Saladin in some ways was the most barbaric Muslim leaders of the Crusade up to that point. Yet he was willing to use whatever tools necessary to carry out the jihad he had waged against the Christians, including mercy and diplomacy. He was so committed to this jihad that there is even a legend that said his last words expressed his frustration at, quote, not staying alive long enough to wipe all the Christians out, end quote. Baldwin had watched Saladin grow in strength and knew that not only was his successor unprepared to lead, he himself did not have the strength to take the field any longer by the time he began sending letters west for help. To further confound the problem in Jerusalem, his sister, Princess Sibylla, seemed intent on remaining married to a man none of Jerusalem wanted to see on the throne, Guy de Lusignan. After both Baldwins died, the lords and powerful bureaucrats in Jerusalem supported Sibylla's rise to the throne under the condition that she divorce her unpopular husband, and in so doing prevent his ascension to the throne. However, it ended up being a moot point. Not only had she not divorced Guy, she personally went against the lords and knights, crowning Guy de Lusignan king with her own hands in a Byzantine ceremony. King Guy took the battlefield fairly quickly, readily understanding the threat posed by Saladin and probably feeling pressure, perceived or real, to prove himself as the new monarch. At his field camp, he held council of war, at which time they decided the army would stay in their positions where they could benefit from their water sources, perhaps the most essential component for hot, arid desert fighting. Later that night, one of the king's most trusted confidants, Renaud de Chatillon, came back and talked the king into moving his force before first light across the arid desert to meet his foe. The primary sources of the Council of War and the events of the subsequent 12 hours did not indicate why the king shifted his position so dramatically against the majority of his council. Instead, Guy de Lusignan sounded the orders through the camp to pack up and march. The Crusader force took to march in the early hours of the day. Finally, they met Saladin in the field of battle at the now infamous place called Hattin. Hattin would prove to be the most memorable and perhaps the most devastating loss of the Crusades in the popular conscience. For Saladin, it was a morale-building precursor that led to his descent upon Jerusalem soon after. Led in part by Balian of Ibelin, the people of the city of Jerusalem manned a historic defense with only a handful of knights, tradesmen, clergy, women, and children. Balian's bravery and fortitude must have gained the respect of Adin because, in an uncharacteristic show of mercy, he gave terms to Balian that included the safe passage, to those that could afford the ransom, of course, from the city to Christian-held land. Naturally, many lives were still ruined being sold into slavery, and those that could not afford to pay the ransom were killed, contrary to popular modern narrative about the Third Crusade. The loss of Jerusalem was not the only news making its way back to Rome. Acre, Jaffa, and nearly all the Crusader gains except for the city of Tyre fell to the Muslim leader Saladin and his forces. Meanwhile, back in Europe, shock seemed to be the general feeling about the loss of Jerusalem. Perhaps among the nobility and the papal leadership, there was a feeling that they had not taken King Baldwin IV's letters, requesting immediate help in Jerusalem, seriously. Even his dramatic package to the Pope containing the key to the city of Jerusalem itself didn't seem to cause rapid enough response in Rome. Perhaps the generations of Europeans born during the run up to the Third Crusade had taken for granted the hard-fought and bloody victory to take Jerusalem, and rested a little too comfortably. After all, for many in this generation, they had only known Jerusalem under Christian control. They may have taken for granted the freedom they enjoyed on the Pilgrim Road before current hostilities. Were it not for the masterful and desperate negotiation from Balian of Ibelin when Jerusalem fell, it could have been a lot worse even then. The fall of every major Christian city in the Holy Land, including Jerusalem, the deaths of Baldwin IV and V in rapid succession, and sale into slavery of over 12,000 Christians who couldn't afford Saladin's ransom, sent the message loud and clear that woke Europe and the Pope from their complacency. Thank you for listening, and I look forward to talking to you next time when we meet Richard the Lion-Hearted and take the field for the Third Crusade to the Holy Land. Talk to you next time.